Meister, and I will be moderating this event. This is not an event like any other. This is actually a space created as a space for consultation. Um, so we will actually be looking to hear your questions based on a few presentations that my colleague, who is my pleasure to introduce, Selena Ryder, or head of policy and strategy at the GCF, will be walking us through some inputs, and then we will be hearing from you your perspectives and how we can do things better. But before I do that, let me provide a little bit of context. So the Green Climate Fund is at this moment it is in the middle of its replenishment process. This is something that we do every 4 years to capitalize and have the necessary resources for doing our work. But hand in hand with that comes the process of actually trying to define the strategy, trying to define what is it that we intend to do, what is it that we intend to achieve, how do we intend to do it. So it's a lot of questions of what, when, how, and that is what we are in the middle of. This process is a process that we try to make as open, inclusive, and transparent as possible. And with this, we hope to have an updated strategic plan providing providing the programming directions for the GCF between 2024 and 2027, sometime in the fall next year. So let me then welcome you to this consultation. Again, because this is not an event like others, one thing we like to do is to ask you to introduce yourselves so that we sort of can have more of a conversation rather than an open-ended event. And before I do that, before I pass the microphone around, let me ask my colleague Selena to introduce herself.
So, very good evening, everyone. I'm even going to stand up because I know it's 6 o'clock in the evening. I hope everyone's had some coffee, had some food during today. But thank you so much for joining us for this late night event. Please feel free to come closer. My name is Selena Ryder. I am the head of policy and strategy at the Green Climate Fund. I've actually been with the fund for about 5 years, almost creeping up to 6 years. So this is actually the second strategic planning exercise we've been going through, and it's really interesting actually to see how much has changed in that period of time. So let's call this a conversation rather than an event. Thank you, Juan. And yes, because it'll be a small group, obviously, this evening and more of a conversation, it would be great if we could just also learn a little bit about you before we get started, and then we'll launch into the dialogue and the consultation. So back over to you, Juan.
Thank you very much. So let me start maybe over on this end, and I will just pass the microphone. If you can just introduce yourself, where you're coming from, and what brings you to COP. Can I start here? Sure.
Hi, everyone. My name is Stuart Sarkozy Bonacy. I am based in Washington, D.C. Most of the time, I work for the Resilient Cities Network and also the founder of Precovery Labs. So I am involved in city resilience planning, financing, island and ocean related activities. So much of the consultation is very interesting in terms of where we go from here with the Green Climate Fund. So thank you.
Hi, I'm Barbara Rosen-Jacobson. I am an advocacy advisor with Mercy Corps. I look at all of this from a bit of a humanitarian angle. I've been following adaptation, loss and damage quite a bit, and I really hope to see more climate finance going to those that are most vulnerable and fragile. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Tara Daniel with the Women's Environment and Development Organization, and I follow the GCF as an observer and part of the GCF Observer Network of Civil Society, Indigenous Peoples, and Local Communities. And here at COP, I'm also caucusing and strategizing with the women and gender constituency.
Thank you. I'm Jean-Louis Biwole from the Cameroon. I'm a director in charge of cooperation in Special Fund for Local Authorities in Cameroon. And we are in a process of accreditation near the Green Climate Fund. And that's why I'm there. Thank you.
Hello, thank you. My name is Alexander Stoltz. I'm with the University of Pennsylvania Law School. I'm here with my class. We're researching subnational access to adaptation finance.
Hi, I'm Saija Vuola from Finland. Finland is a contributor to the GCF, and I'm an advisor to our board member.
Hello, everyone. My name is Mia Stolt. I'm from the Namibia Nature Foundation. We're also currently civil society observers to the GCF, but have also been nominated to become an accredited entity. And I'm at the COP with the Namibian delegation following adaptation negotiations.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jacqueline Okeo. I am an affordable housing policy advisor working in New York as well as South Africa. My role really is to look at how energy efficient housing and decarbonized housing can be accelerated, not just in sub-Saharan Africa, but also looking at learning lessons from Western countries that could be applied back on the continent. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Hansel Park. I am a multilateral governance officer at the Green Climate Fund. Thanks, I'm with these folks.
Thank you very much. So with this, we certainly seem to have quite a diverse group, perspectives that range from the more sort of sector-specific applied knowledge to some of our sort of day-to-day partners looking to program resources. So we're very much looking forward to your inputs. What I'd like to do now is to ask Selena to briefly walk us through the actual process that is ahead of us on the updating of the strategic plan, and then after that we will break it up in a few more tangible, digestible sections. So Selena.
Thanks. So if I can ask our wonderful technical support to bring up the presentation, but don't worry, we're not going to bore you with death by presentation today. The idea, as Juan mentioned, is I'll just talk through a couple of slides, stop, see if there's any questions, see if there's any feedback you want to give us, and then we'll work through that way. So let me move straight into, let's call it the boring stuff, but the necessary stuff. Here we've basically got the timeline and the process that we're working through for updating our strategic plan. So our board launched this process in April, and it actually called on us specifically to do an open, transparent, inclusive consultation process. So this conversation is part of that. We've actually already started work on the document. We had discussions with our board, B33 and B34, that's code for our board meetings, but basically since June and then again in October. And we're currently working on actually developing a full draft for release back to our board. So that's why this conversation comes at such a critical moment, because we're really putting the bones of it all together now. It should be finalized basically by July next year. And then that will lead into, Juan mentioned, our fund is actually almost exhausted the resources it has for climate change programming. The end of our current programming period is 2023. So we'll actually be going back to our wonderful contributors for more dollars to keep the mission going over the 24 to 27 period. And of course, you'll see there a small plug to our website where you can actually find all of the consultation materials. So just to give you a little bit of from the bird's eye view first, what's the approach we've taken to this update of the strategic plan? You'll see on the left-hand side there what we see as our organization's building blocks. So we have a governing instrument that was actually approved by the UNFCCC COP. We have a theory of change, which I'll actually speak to in a second. And then, of course, the way we work. So our business model, we work with our partner accredited entities to deliver funding, our operating model, strategies, policies, etc. What we did within this strategic plan update process is also take a little bit of a step back and look at how the world had changed. Obviously, major developments happening in the world over the last couple of years, both in terms of our understanding of climate change, the IPCC report that's been released, the actual impacts that we're seeing on the ground, as we've seen in some of the major natural events this year, but also more broadly economically. So we know that the world has changed with the COVID pandemic. basically with the economic response, a lot of countries actually experiencing increased debt burdens and stress, and then already going into a period of enhanced conflict. So we kind of looked at all of that as our investment context, what's actually changing. We then looked at this question of what GCF particularly can bring. We know it's a busy landscape actually in terms of climate financing institutions. There's lots of people working, so it's a good question and puzzle there to work out how our funds can actually have the most impact. And then we looked, as mentioned, at our own organizational maturity. So we're putting all of these pieces together into our updated strategy, and that's basically where we are now. So defining our strategic vision, defining our goals, the goals that we're actually going to set, ambition that we'll set for the 2027 period, as well as the actions that we take to implement that. So I'm actually going to pause there, Juan. That's the boring stuff done, and just see if there are any immediate questions from our wonderful audience before we go into the guts of the strategic plan.
Thanks, Alina. So yes, let us turn to you, see if there are any questions or clarifications on this initial introductory framing slides before we turn into a little bit more of the details on vision. So let me pause before turning to the next session. Yes. Do you have the mic there?
I don't know. I think maybe let me not speak on behalf of everyone, but I have never heard of this Green Climate Fund, and maybe just an understanding of how your fund operates, just an overview maybe of your operating model, just to understand the sectors that you're targeting. And I've just had a brief look through your website, maybe just a high-level overview.
Absolutely. Always happy to start from the basics for people who don't know us. So we were established by the UNFCCC COP. We're the operating entity of the financial mechanism of the COP. So part of our mandate is actually to serve the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. And so what we're asked to do is support developing countries basically in being able to achieve their commitments made through the UNFCCC and Paris Agreement. So the way we work, we only fund developing countries for a start, and we fund climate change. We fund mitigation and adaptation action. The way we work is we actually have a focal point, a national designated authority is the technical name, in each of the countries we work with, who's basically our major focal point on programming, on the interactions with that country. And then our funding actually goes through what we call accredited entities. They're our funding partners. So they're the ones that design the projects. They might work with various other organizations on the ground. Our accredited entities can be government ministries, they can be CSOs, they can be international financial institutions, multilateral development banks, private equity funds, you name it. I think we've got it in the mix of accredited entities. So that's the way we work. In terms of the sectors we cover, everything as it relates to climate change, but of course with the IPCC, we're particularly focused sort of through the lens of those systems transitions as we go forward. So the energy system transition, the infrastructure system transition, the food and ecosystems transition, and then the societal transition, of course, all connected to the lens of climate change. So how we can take climate action.
Thank you. Very important question. Sometimes framing is key. So let me perhaps see if there are any other questions. Otherwise, what I'd like to do is invite you, Selena, to tell us a little bit to start off by speaking of the vision and what is it that we hope to do and that we hope to achieve through the strategic plan.
Thanks, Juan. So this is maybe actually a nice follow-up from that last question. So what you'll see on the slide here is, well, one of the points of feedback we got through the earlier part of our consultation process is that people really wanted to understand how the GCF would contribute to the UNFCCC and Paris Agreement goals. So what contribution would the fund be making, bearing in mind, of course, the scale of its resources? So what you see on the screen here is basically kind of, I guess, our logical chain of how we contribute to the UNFCCC and Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement goals being, of course, holding temperature well below 2 degrees, striving for 1.5, trying to keep that alive. Enhancing adaptive capacity and resilience, so our contribution to the global goal on adaptation, as well as making finance flows overall, so more broadly, obviously, than institutions like GCF, consistent with pathways towards low emission, climate resilient development. So what our governing instrument asks us to do is basically support this overall mandate, support developing countries in implementing the UNFCCC and Paris Agreement, and to promote paradigm shift. Now, what does that mean, promoting paradigm shift? I think that's the thing we've been stewing over in terms of our strategic plan. So we actually see that happening through a couple of ways at the fund. We actually invest in capacity, and we invest in projects. So one of the things we do through both our accreditation process, that's the partners we work with, but also through our readiness program, which is basically the world's biggest climate capacity building program. It's currently funded up to about $450 million over our lifespan so far. So what we can use those tools to do is actually build the capacity in countries and their programming entities to undertake climate investment. So it's actually a huge thing. It requires a lot of brains. It requires a lot of know-how to actually move from having an NDC on paper to turning that into investments that can attract finance. And so one of the ways that we see the GCF actually creating this paradigm shift is in that institutional change of how does the world get ready to actually do climate change investment. So that's one part. The other part is, of course, our projects. So our funding proposals, we make investments that can be grants, they can be concessional loans, they can be equity, they can be guarantees. And what we're looking for in those funding proposals is how can we fund those actions that sort of push that systems change, that push towards paradigm shift in terms of both adaptation and mitigation and across all of the sectors that you're interested in. We've in fact developed a series of sector guides. There's actually 10 of them across the different sectors where we explore in a lot of detail. These things are hundreds of pages long, but basically what those paradigm shift potential pathways are. So that's kind of the lens in which we're looking at that overall vision. And if I flick to the next slide, as we think about really trying to sharpen this up for this strategic plan for our next programming period, as mentioned, we've had this mandate of paradigm shift for a while, but we've been asked to get a little bit more concrete in terms of what that means. So the way we're thinking about that at this point in time is that really we want to see every developing country have the capacity to actually turn those NDCs, turn their national adaptation plans, turn their long-term strategies into climate investments. So being the partner that will actually work with every developing country to put those capacities in place at a national level. And then the second component being to accelerate those systems transitions, accelerate the transitions that the IPCC tells us we need to achieve in energy, in industry, infrastructure, ecosystems, and societal systems. And we hope that by doing that, we can really accelerate progress towards both the 2030 commitments that countries have made, but then ultimately towards those long-term goals of the Paris Agreement and UNFCCC. So that's our attempt at re-articulating this vision. That's what we're actually seeking to consult on, because this is not yet locked in stone. This is what we'll be discussing, debating with our board, with our stakeholders. So I think that's maybe a good time to actually stop, go back to the audience, see if this makes sense to you, see if there are elements that you would like to see introduced into this vision to make it stronger.
Thanks. So thank you very much, Selena. So let us go back to you for any reactions. Keep in mind, again, we're starting right now with vision. In a few minutes, we'll of course hope to go a little bit more into the how, talking about the programming goals, talking about some of the programming priorities. But at this point, what we want to make sure is that this vision we're trying to propose is one that speaks to the needs that you hear here in the corridors. It's one that speaks to the science base, to the needs that you hear in the context of achieving the objectives of the convention, and that is in that sense suitable and realistic at the same time, which I know it's a dual question. So
ambitious
and ambitious,
and realistic.
doable, really. So let me start maybe with the colleague from University of Pennsylvania, and then we go from. Thank you.
Hello. So I was at the high-level ministerial dialogue about the. Sorry, I was at the high-level ministerial dialogue about the new collective commitment for funding, and they were talking a lot about how mitigation has really overshadowed adaptation and allocation of funds and financing. And I was wondering how, like, that is tying into your strategy moving forward.
Okay, I'll take that one straight away. I saw there was another hand go up. So in terms of the Green Climate Fund's commitment, we have actually had a commitment all the way through our operations to fund 50% mitigation, 50% adaptation. So that is already built, I guess, into our DNA, if you like. And then within the adaptation financing, we also have a commitment to give at least 50% of the adaptation finance to SIDS, LDCs, and African states. So particularly vulnerable countries in our, I guess, our lexicon. We're actually delivering at significantly more than that. So currently almost 70% of our adaptation funding is going to those particularly vulnerable countries. That being said, we would like to see the fund do more. Look, and I'm speaking on behalf of the Secretariat here. Of course, everything that we'll be discussing here that you'll be inputting to will go to our board. But I think that we actually did have a call coming out of the Cancun agreements that the fund should be set up to channel basically a majority share of new multilateral financing for adaptation. So we hope to be able to live up to that mandate. And the way we're thinking about our programming, and I'll actually come to it in a couple of slides, so I might not say too much more, is just to think in more precise terms, how do we start to bring that profile, but also the possibilities of finance to adaptation in the same way it's been brought to mitigation. One of the things we've found for mitigation, for example, is, you know, we've been thinking about it for a while. Renewable energy has kind of had a boom over the last couple of decades or so because the policy interventions were made, allowing the markets to come in, the supply chains to be built, more finance to start flowing to renewable energy. So how do we actually start to think about a similar pathway for adaptation, where you might start with public financing, you start with public policy interventions, but also opening up pathways to bring wider sources of financing into adaptation. Because in the end, we know that we'll never have enough public financing to do everything the world needs on both mitigation and adaptation. So we really need to think creatively about that, but that's something we're very committed to do.
Thank you. And just a reminder to everyone, these are kind of like karaoke singing microphones, so you have to speak very close to them.
I won't sing. I have a couple of questions, but I'm very curious to see the rest of the presentation. But one of the kind of bigger picture questions that I have is obviously the vision is really to accelerate and to have this big impact. And at the same time, I also, when scanning the slide, I see quite some mentions of local. So how do you balance kind of this need for locally led adaptation with this kind of big vision and the kind of big grants that are provided through the GCF?
Thanks. So it's absolutely critical actually to bring both together. And we I guess we don't make that leap in one bound. We work very much through our partnerships. And it's our partnerships that help us bring that locally led action together. So let me give you a concrete example. That's a little general. So what we've done actually through a number of our funding proposals, there's one particular that comes to mind, which is a Vanuatu funding proposal because we did it quite recently. But what we can actually do is work with our partners to create whether grant mechanisms or on-lending mechanisms, it depends on the community and what the needs are within that developing country, where we put money into that program or facility whatever it may be. And then that facility can be designed to get money onto the ground. So whether through women's-led organizations, to smallholder farmers, to local cooperatives, through local NGOs, I think, so the participation of all of those actors is possible through designing that kind of a funding proposal for us. We actually have, it has a special name when we work with a direct access entity. It's called the Enhanced Direct Access modality. But we actually likewise can work with our international entity partners on similar kind of arrangements. So, and that's a very, very powerful thing, because one of the things we absolutely want to do is bring that on-ground local knowledge of what the actual solutions are. You know, you can sit in an office in Korea, or you can sit even in a regional office somewhere, but not have that full appreciation of what are the impacts on the ground, what's going to work on the ground. So how do you actually activate that local knowledge? And this is a way to do that, to try and sort of bring the two partnerships together. Again, I'll say partnerships a lot, I think, through this presentation, because that's really the way we work. But bring partnerships together where you can bring the finance on one side and the local knowledge and action on the other side.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Selena. So why don't we maybe now go to the midterm programming goals? And could you tell us about what goals should guide the GCF through 2020, knowing precisely that between now, through 2030 rather, knowing precisely that this is a critical decade for achieving the transitions that you were just talking about?
Thanks, Juan. So this is an area, and I know as we went round for the introductions, there are people here that are specialized in certain sectors, in certain programming areas. So this is an area where we really actually need your help. We need to bring together some collective thinking. So what we've been asked by our board to think about is how can the fund actually set ambitious, we call it midterm programming goals. So that might be for 2027, that's our next replenishment period. 2030, that's the end of this critical decade. 2035. What you see on the screen, it might look a little perplexing. You might be thinking, what do these dots have to do with it? What you see on the screen is actually the result of a survey that was recently done at our global programming conference. So we brought together all of our developing country partner focal points, as well as our accredited entities, and asked, what are your priorities? What would you like to see us focus on in the next programming period? And you can see, because, you know, as I mentioned before, there's different financing mechanisms out there, and actually different financing mechanisms are better fit for different things. So let's work out what GCF can actually best help do. So you can see on the screen there the results, and you can see the huge weighting, particularly across all of the ecosystems areas, if I can use that in the broad. So food and agriculture, forests, ecosystems, nature-based solutions, as well as ocean protection and the blue economy. Definitely a big interest there in the energy transition, just energy transition. Early warning systems is really key, actually having those real fundamentals in place to process climate information about what the climate risks are going to be, how are they going to hit my communities, our people, and what can we do about it. So they were some of the concentrations we saw, and I think the challenge that set for us is how can GCF then interpret that into concrete, ambitious, measurable programming goals for the next period. So as I flick this up, here are some of the things we're thinking of. Of course, it's important not to have too many goals. But firstly, I already mentioned climate information, early warnings for all. The UN Secretary General has just launched a call to basically have early warning systems for all countries by 2027. Because there's something like 60% of the world's countries, 30% of the world's population that's not actually already covered by early warning systems. And we can see from the floods in Pakistan earlier this year how devastating that can be if countries are not actually prepared for the worst of climate impacts. So that's one area that the GCF could be contributing to. We know that making the energy transition is critical. One of the things we're keen to understand is what ambition do the developing country NDCs set for energy transition by 2030? How can we play into that? On infrastructure, We're actually working on a pilot program in Jamaica, which is looking at diagnosing from the climate impacts, basically their critical risk spots. So what are the areas where climate change is going to hit the worst, where there's most highest value infrastructure at risk? And we're trying to develop a pilot program that actually identifies those areas and then designs a mix of gray and green. So that's the concrete stuff, but then also the ecosystems, nature-based solutions to best respond to those critical climate risks. And there's potential for us to roll out that pilot to many more countries. Ecosystems, nature-based solutions is a huge focus this COP. We've also got the biodiversity COP coming up in just a few weeks' time. So how do we contribute to the global targets that might be set around that? And then I already mentioned agriculture. I think this statistic keeps changing over time. 500 million smallholder farmers, that's at the household level, not the individual, at risk of climate change. The latest data says that might be going up to 600 million. So how do we make sure those farmers that are actually critically dependent on the natural ecosystem, on precipitation, on drought conditions, and basically food security and livelihoods being critical, particularly in the African continent, how do we make sure that they are resilient to climate change? So there are some of the areas, Juan, that we are thinking in, but this is very much a space to be filled in at the moment. So very happy to hear from the audience if they have ideas to share on this question of how we can direct our programming ambition for 2030.
Thanks, Alina. And then back to you. Does this speak to the overall trends and needs that what you're hearing? That this speak to this transition towards sort of reaching some of the goals the international community has set by 2050 and what that means by 2030? The floor is open.
Yeah, I'm Osman Mohammed from the Center for Renewable Energy and Action on Climate Change, an NGO based in Nigeria. We are also a CFSO member to GEF and GCF. So it is an observation or a suggestion or a question. Recently, we constructed a clinic, a solar-powered clinic of 2.4 kilowatts, a 6,000 liter power, 6,000 liters of water supply, where people can drink, and as well as livestock can also drink. We also, with the same, under the same project, we constructed an agroforestry training center. So all in all, in one project, less than 29,000 euro. So the issue is that those local communities down there don't usually get access to this funding, and those local NGOs that are working directly with the communities don't also get access to this funding. So if you look at the amount of money spent on salaries for these organization staffs, if that could be converted, only that money alone could be given to those rural areas, those NGOs, those civil society organizations that are working directly in those rural areas. It will make a very big impact. So what is GEF and GCF doing to like castigate or to cascade those funding to include those communities, those civil societies that are working in those rural areas directly? Thank you.
Well, first of all, congratulations on the project. It sounds wonderful, and this idea of kind of looking cross-sectoral, looking at agroforestry as well as renewable energy and then providing social protection is a wonderful lens because you're tackling multiple problems at once. I think the call for us to work better in complementarity is a good one. I want to be upfront about GCF. So we're often known, I think, for being big, bureaucratic, and slower processes. And that is built into our design. So because of the way we work, because we don't fund directly, quite honestly, we don't have the staff to. So basically the way we're set up is to fund through our accredited entity partners. We tend to, I think, have a, let's call it a comparative advantage or the nature of the way we work tends to be at scale. So because of the processes that are involved in actually coming to GCF funding, we tend to look at projects that are at scale. So our small category is actually $10 million, going up to a large category of several $100 million. And so while we can provide the kinds of options I discussed earlier, where we actually partner with one of our accredited entities to design something that can then push smaller grants out, we don't have a window at the moment for organizations like yourself to come to ours directly. But this is something that we have to work on. I can't speak on behalf of Jeff colleagues. They're not here at this event. But I think it's something that we have to work on in complementarity with other funders in the landscape. So if GCF is targeting that larger scale, I actually have a slide on it later, but the larger scale type projects, how do we make sure that elsewhere in the climate finance landscape, there are funds available for the more direct support, direct grants for smaller projects like your own, because it does sound like a wonderful project.
Thanks, Selena. Any other questions or reactions, please?
Thanks, and I apologize, I was a bit late, so I might not focus necessarily on the midterm programming goals specifically, but I just wanted to know, because a lot of discussions have been happening at COP in all of the finance negotiation rooms, and I'm just thinking about how the GCF is reflecting about, if you are aware, and how are you reflecting about these discussions that have been happening in the financing negotiation rooms, because they are, I would say, quite clearly against the direction that the GCF is trying to take the USP for the second replenishment. There's a lot of pushback against this push towards, catalyzing finance, becoming a co-financier, and all of these things that, the GCF has been pushing with the USP for the second replenishment. And it's been quite clear from all of the discussions throughout all the topics that developing countries are really not, let's say, in agreement to this direction. And it's been quite clear in the guidance and the discussions on the guidance for the GCF. And so it's been brought into question, where this direction that the GCF is taking is coming from, because it's clearly not coming from its board members from developing countries. And so I'm just wondering if you've had any time, I know it's quite on the spot because the COP negotiations are still ongoing, but if you've had any time to reflect on this, which clearly contradicts the direction you're presenting here. And also just like, looking at the midterm programming goals, if you've also had time to reflect on, let's say, the results that the GCF has had and how they are framed, especially when you speak about 500+ million smallholder farmers and stuff like that. What has the GCF learned from the past implementation, and how they measure the results by just the number of people or smallholder farmers that you're reaching out? So just a few questions on that in that sense.
No problem. I'm actually going to take the second one first and come back to the first one, because it dovetails into my next slide. And that will also give Juan a bit of time to think, because he is actually the one that's been following the finance negotiations. So I'll come back to Juan, actually, if I can kind of take over your moderator role for a perspective on that. But to the question of results measurement first, I think one thing it is important to say is that our portfolio is still very, very young. So we've been around for about 10 years on paper. We've been funding for about 7 years. And a lot of the projects that we've funded have 5, 10, 15-year lifetimes. This is at the funding proposal. Our readiness proposals move a bit faster. So in terms of seeing those results, while we do have now 80% of our portfolio in implementation, it's still relatively early days in terms of implementation. So we've got some information on expected results, but we're really just bringing in through our project reporting the understanding of actual results. And that does actually make doing this strategic planning process a challenge, because we're just trying to calibrate how do we play into the global ambition with what are those lessons we're seeing from our portfolio. That being said, we do have a new results management framework that was approved by the board recently. What that will do is for our future projects, it will actually strengthen the measurement. We're going to be going beyond tons and beneficiaries, which is the two metrics a lot use, and actually looking at both a wider set of mitigation and adaptation measurements, but also looking at how we can start to understand paradigm shift impact through that results framework. So that's work that we're excited about. In the meantime, I think we're just trying to harvest what we can from our portfolio expected results so far, from the lessons, from the reporting that's come in so far. So we're doing that very actively, and it's a space I think we're excited about, we'll grow into as we actually mature our portfolio further in implementation. In terms of the first question, I think it is important to go to this slide because I might slightly nuance the point you made about the USP directions being contradictory. I think one of the things that is very important for the fund is, of course, the way we were set up was intentionally to have a balance of developing country representation on our board in our processes. So just like in the UNFCCC, for a lot of our work, a lot of our strategies, policies, you'll see this dialogue, negotiation happening between a more developing country perspective, a more developed country perspective. But that being said, our portfolio definitely reflects a diversity of types of programming, of types of action. And as we're thinking about our programming directions for this USP, you can see on the screen here, one of the things we've actually suffered from in the past is actually being expected to do everything. So everything all at once, all the time, all the way from small grants on the ground, locally led action, early warning systems, and then more highly catalytic private sector projects, de-risking, lines of credits with bank, equity funds. So one of actually the great challenges for us in this strategic plan is to work out how do we keep that balance, of course trying to represent the interests of developing countries, but also trying to secure as much finance as we can for developing countries. And so what you see on the screen here is, again, a first attempt coming out of our latest board meeting. So the board did see this, to strike that programming balance. And so coming out of the board meeting, they actually noted a document which had all of these 7 pillars as areas for GCF programming action. So starting on the left, as I mentioned, using our readiness money to actually build the capacity for climate investments and for direct access entity programming. Second, focusing on those critical early warning system building blocks, as well as measures to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage. The fund has been asked to do that by the COP. Third is innovating new climate solutions. Fourth, as mentioned, locally led action. We do need to do more to address urgent vulnerabilities right now. The fifth is around system or sectoral transitions. So here where we're talking about the energy transition, the food system transition, the industry transition. I've lost my count. Sixth is the de-risking private sector finance at scale, where really we're trying to use our money to unlock those wider private finance flows. But we know that this is only mature in a few sectors. So this tends to be more prospective in energy, in the mitigation areas, in energy efficiency and transport. But we're starting to see some potential emerge in adaptation as well, where we've now got a number of private sector transactions that are actually unlocking, for example, funding for climate resilient agricultural practices and services and goods. And then, I didn't get the last column right. That was my editing. The last one is actually around greening the financial system. So this is working with both public development banks and private banks. We actually have quite a number of direct access entities that are banks and that are basically looking at how is climate change going to impact my investment portfolio? How do I prepare for the physical risks? How do I prepare for the transition risks? And then in addition to that, helping those banks actually access capital markets to, again, get more finance in total behind developing countries' priorities. So I'm going to go to Juan to elaborate on that, but I did think it was important to clarify that, you know, if there's a perception that we're all about private sector, it's a bit of a misconception. Our portfolio really is very balanced at the moment. For example, our portfolio is about 35% private sector funding, which means it's 65% public funding. So I do want to do think it's important, and happy to take follow-up questions as well, but also just to clarify the misconception about where our programming currently is and where we could potentially see it going. Again, of course, subject to where our board makes the final decisions. But back over to you, Juan.
Thanks. No, I think I'll rather keep it very brief because the reality is that, of course, we are right now in the middle of a political and the things that we hear, if we were to go by sort of the as if we were to go by the text as it was this morning, we will be dealing with 139 different issues that we need to respond, and that's just absolutely impossible. We cannot be everything for everyone at the same time everywhere. Otherwise, you just begin to spread yourself too thin, which is precisely why we're trying to have this strategic plan process be as inclusive as possible, so that we speak to what are sort of core strategic priorities. Having said that, of course, I think one thing that people sort of in the negotiations, you sort of, if you enter in the room, it's easy to forget that at the end of the day, the multilateral funds don't account to more than 5% of the total climate finance flows. And the expectations and the way in which we speak sort of tend to suggest that you tend to sort of channel comments that are directed to the entirety of all the climate finance flows. And this is something we then are really trying to balance, because of course we want to be responsive to countries, but at the end of the day, we need to put priorities in paper. And we are trying really hard this time to have a collaborative, consultative process to come up with these strategic objectives. We are very mindful. A lot of the comments that have been made in the negotiations, I think, are very valid, and are some of the things that we're trying to address here, maybe not in the same way that they're being proposed. For example, we don't think that we will be able to create, as of this morning when I counted, there were 7 windows. There were 7 different windows that they were being asked for us to sort of begin channeling resources. There's no way that you can run a trust fund if every year you create more and more windows. It starts to become quite chaotic. That is not to say, however, that we cannot try to integrate those priorities. For example, as Selena has said, in dealing with some of the risk screening for loss and damage, that doesn't necessarily require that we create a brand new window. So it's a little bit of this balancing act that we're trying to do. I don't think that we will get it right, but that's part of the sort of imperfect nature of this process. So with that, of course, before we go to the next portion, let us see if there are any, again, this is a dialogue, any reactions, any further questions, please.
Yeah, just a bit of a reaction to that and what you were presenting as your vision earlier, because even recognizing that you are less than 5% of the total climate finance flows, the GCF is positioned very uniquely to be a flagship for Paris implementation in a way that no other fund is. And having had gender as part of your founding instrument, having the Indigenous Peoples Policy, having the work that you've done on ESS, and the work that you've done to have a best practice independent redress mechanism really does put you in a position to leverage those best practices and to show what the very best, what the highest standards of gender just, human rights centered climate action can and should look like. And I don't feel that that is really coming across strongly in your vision and that role, which is not catalyzing change through financial instruments, but in showing through your particularly transparent processes and through your shared governance what can and should be possible and the expectations that we have for the enactment of climate action across all other funds, including MDBs and all of the partners that you leverage through your incredibly wide accredited entity network. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I turn to Selena, any other comments or?
Thank you. I have two questions. One of them is more out of curiosity, but I've been following, and it's quite political, but I've been following loss and damage negotiations, discussions, and I'm very curious what kind of your perspective on this is as a fund, especially because there are calls for finance facilities, or a finance facility. Of course, I'm very curious what you think about this, but also what kind of lessons learned you might have from the process of, emerging yourself as a fund. And then the second question is, because in the vision and in these programming directions, there is a reference to vulnerability as well. And I think it's really great that such a large percentage is going to SIDS and Africa and LDCs. But within those countries, it's obviously still a very large category of countries. How do you make sure that the most vulnerable are being supported, including those contexts where it's a little bit more difficult to act, such as areas that are in conflict or extremely vulnerable or not very well accessible? Thank you.
Okay, so maybe Selena, we can start with you, and I'm happy to take the loss and damage question.
Thank you, Juan. I'm glad you're happy to take the loss and damage question. I'll make a few reflections on it. First, I thank you for the comment and the feedback on gender Indigenous peoples safeguards. I was actually speaking at an event earlier today, actually, on the GCF gender commitment that's in our governing instrument, as you mentioned, also how it's operationalized in our updated gender policy. All I can say is maybe it's become a bit too mainstreamed for us in some ways, and we need to actually elevate that commitment back up to a higher level. But it's absolutely fundamentally part of the way we work. And actually in the session before this, we had our Indigenous Peoples Advisory Group, which has been, I think this is the first COP in which they've been constituted, and we've actually been consulting them very actively on the strategic plan as well. So it's a fantastic comment and definitely well noted. In terms of, maybe I'll take the second one first, and then we can end on loss and damage and come back to you. So you're right. Yes, there are obviously, I guess there's a scale of vulnerability. It's slightly politically dangerous ground to walk on in terms of looking at that scale. But one way I guess we can look at it, and one of the comments that has come through in the consultation process for the strategic plan is, so within that vulnerable group, are there countries that have not actually yet accessed funding? So I think our readiness program actually pretty much has as broad a coverage as it can. Almost every developing country that wants to access it has accessed it. But certainly for our funding proposal programming, there are still some gaps there. So that is one thing that we're looking at as a result of this consultation and input process, is for those countries that haven't had their own national funding proposal, what have been the barriers in those specific cases, and what might we be able to do to address those barriers. Coming back to the readiness program, one of the other things we're conscious of, and I should say, we know there's been a lot of frustration about readiness because people have experienced delays relative to the size of the grants. They really want us to enhance access on that, and we're taking that very seriously. So we've actually been implementing some operational reforms over the course of this year. But again, we're also bringing a revised readiness strategy to our board next March, where we are really hoping to sort of radically simplify both the policy structure for the readiness program, as well as the implementation and delivery of that. But one of the things that could be explored in this context, again, from our side, it's an idea at the moment, subject to our board's deliberation, is whether we might be able to look at sort of more direct support for those countries that really, even with their national focal point, do not have the capacity to engage with GCF. So I think this is our experience in some of the least developed countries, that you have sometimes one person, GCF is 5% of their job, And really, they simply don't have even the basic fundamental capacities to engage with us, to put together funding proposals, to respond to our comments, etc. So that might be one thing to be done in the case of countries that really have very limited capacity, is how can we actually, I guess, bolster that basic capacity to engage with us. There are other examples. For example, I think fragile conflict affected states where there are genuine questions about, you know, is that from a programming perspective, from a risk perspective, the right place for GCF to be, while there may be other interventions, for example, humanitarian interventions, post-conflict interventions that are happening on the ground. So in some cases, we're actually not even able to sort of get into some countries in some cases. So that's, again, it's a particularly tricky problem. I think actually your colleague was here in one of our earlier events, sort of highlighting both the challenges but potential there, you know, for climate change funding still, of course, to make a difference. The only thing I'll say on loss and damage before turning over to Juan, and it comes back to the point Juan just made about programming choices. So fundamentally, we have finite resources. We had about 10 billion pledged in our initial replenishment. We had another 10 billion pledged, but through a very generous doubling of contributions by the donors that stayed with us for that first replenishment in our second replenishment. So we have to make some decisions about what we do with those resources. And within our current COP mandate, we do fund measures to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage. They're generally funded through our adaptation programming window. So we have mitigation window and an adaptation window. In terms of this discussion about loss and damage and should there be a dedicated facility, a financing pool for this, one of the things I guess that we have to be conscious of as GCF is that if there are not additional resources attached, you having to make programming choices between mitigation, between adaptation, between loss and damage. And I think we are really taking that cue from, this is the critical decade. This is the decade in which we have to act to keep 1.5 alive. So we still really do have to keep focused on mitigation. We hear the warnings from science. So we know we really have to focus on preparing countries for adaptation, trying to reduce those risks as much as possible, trying to reduce the loss and damage as much as possible. And so we hear the call on loss and damage, but it's a pretty tough decision, right? When you've only got a fixed pool of resource, it's, do you put it into prevention or do you put it into cure? And how much of it as GCF should we put into prevention versus cure? And we know we need to do a lot of prevention. But with that, I'll hand to Juan.
Thanks, Selena. Probably very little to say except that I think it's, first of all, it's absolutely critical to underscore that we recognize the very legitimate concern that that vulnerable countries are putting forward and the urgency around it. We were mandated to, within our existing policies, provide support back in Madrid, and we have been demonstrated that it is possible to support certain things. For example, we have managed to do a lot of the work on the sort of risk assessment. We have managed to do some work on risk transfer as well, even some work on rehabilitation, but equally, in an equal spirit of transparency, we have said very clearly there are some things that we are just not set up to do. And we don't want to sort of try to make it seem like, yeah, if you give more money, we can do it all. We want to be very, very clear, and we have been very clear that things that relate to, for example, humanitarian assistance, sort of like fast disaster response, that is something that we're not set up to do. When it comes to some of the work around insurance, that is something that we're not set up to do, to act as a reinsurer of any sort. And so we've been quite transparent around this. As to, of course, now it's up to the parties to decide what that means in terms of what kind of arrangements they want to make, and whether they wish to sort of have a one standalone mechanism that will deal with everything, or try to sort of pull from the different expertise and maybe complement with something else. again, that's part of the political process. But we remained, of course, trying to be. We remained as the example of what was the latest institution that it was created, and in how long it took to get it up and running. And I think that's something very important that people need to keep in mind as they are deciding what model and arrangement they wish to use. That's probably going a little too much into politics for what we had hoped for this session, but I hope that answers. So, Selena, why don't we go to the next portion? So if I can ask you to go in a little bit more detail on the strategic objectives and the strategic directions. Sorry,
Let's go.
okay. Sorry, if we can actually now go a little bit into how the GCF is to be different from others, where it fits in the finance climate landscape, and I guess, very much in line with what I just said, what the GCF cannot do.
Thanks, Juan. Yes, we managed to dovetail the strategic objectives conversation into the answer to the question. But please, if anyone has any feedback, either on the vision, on the programming goals, on the strategic objectives, comments, questions, happy to take, after you've had some time to think, feedback on any of those prior topics as well. So as I mentioned, one of the things we've actually been asked to think about, and this has come through quite heavily in the consultation process, is how on earth does GCF fit with everyone else who's out there? And basically, what is it that GCF does or can do that's not being done by others? And it's very interesting, actually, that this conversation is happening, this COP, in a way that I don't think I've heard it quite before, in terms of sort of partners, donors working together to actually work out what role we might respectively play in that bigger picture. So here's the way we've envisioned it, and I can actually give Juan and Alisha, who's hiding over there, and their team credit in trying to put this together. I also love the fact that it's pink. Thanks, Juan. But how do we position GCF? So we thought about this. There's a lot of dimensions through which you can think about this. We thought about it through 4. We thought about it through scale. We thought about it through risk. We thought about it through financial instruments, and we thought about it through our reach. So basically, organizations that operate globally versus those that operate in certain countries. And here's our attempt to integrate 4D in 2D PowerPoint. But you can see here that on the sort of that left top lightest corner, we see that there are institutions that are really very well equipped to experiment. So they tend to operate at a smaller scale, but can be very high risk appetite, grant funding, smaller size grant funding, and really providing that kind of seed for experimentation. So here we've got our colleagues in the Climate Finance Lab, for example, who take calls for innovative proposals and really provide the startup support for that. We've got the Adaptation Fund and actually our colleagues at the GCF, who are both running quite hard on innovation actually in this latest programming cycles, seeing what can be done again with the smaller ticket sizes to get great new ideas up and running. In terms of climate change mitigation, adaptation, and cross-cutting into other programming areas, and then our philanthropies. If I skip over the middle and go to the bottom darker pink segment, we've then got where we actually see a lot of our accredited entity partners, but also the wider financial system. So these guys can fund at way, way bigger scale than us, but generally tend to be more risk averse. So that is their pricing will be higher, or they just won't be willing to come in and put money into deals without something else basically to prop that up. And there you've got your development finance institutions, your national development banks, multilateral development banks, commercial lenders and institutional investors. But when we talk about shifting the financial flows, that's where the trillions are. We're in the billions, the low billions, but that pink segment is where the trillions are. So that's where you're really trying to move the money. And you can see that we have placed GCF, along with some others. Our partners also work in this space, but really in that middle segment as a bridge. So being able to work at that mid-scale, as I mentioned before, our small projects, so 10 million, our large projects can be a few hundred million, but working in that space where we can both work with Jeff, Adaptation Fund, Climate Finance Lab, and others who are doing that first level on-ground innovation, seeing what works, seeing what we can actually bring to scale, and then seeing if we can actually de-risk, basically put in GCF financing in a way that actually allows much larger financial flows to come from those organizations operating in the lower segment in the mature markets and asset classes. So without getting too technical, and I'm not the person to get too technical, that would need to be our CFO and others on our team. That's basically where we see our positioning in the climate finance landscape.
Thanks, Alina. So I now like to turn it back to you for your reactions, your questions. Does this speak to reality, and does this, most importantly, speak to where the GCF should be, considering the overall landscape of other partners?
Sorry, I had to step away for a call, so I might have missed the beginning. But when I look at this, one of the things that we're doing is developing the Resilient Community Impact Funds. And the research we just did about the entire kind of resilience lending and finance space, our X and Y axes, we did a little differently in terms of grants versus equity, and also what I would call response and recovery all the way through then mitigation, adaptation, and our version or definition of resilience. And so I would love almost to see where you sit or want to sit, because I think you've been saying, right, mitigation still has to play such a major role, and I wouldn't disagree with that. And in fact, it's wonderful to hear about the adaptation. But if you did that in a way that showed that kind of linearity in the type of typology, where do you sit in that, and what's most important? Because to me, that's what the board should decide. Where do we sit on that spectrum? Because if you keep going towards adaptation, I'm happy because it kind of aligns with our bigger resilience view, which also includes mitigation. But you then lose that mitigation piece, which feels like the urgency for what it was developed for. So curious about your sort of where you would sit in that and what your decision might be if you had to kind of triangulate that differently or XY it differently, I guess.
Well, first off, I would love to see your XY graph. So I think you did step out for a call, but just trying to work on this back with the team and plot these multiple dimensions on two axes was really not an easy job. We've actually also got it's very difficult to interpret, but we've actually got the instruments there as little colored triangles. Because one of the things that actually we see puts us in that middle category is the fact that we can work with grants, loans, equity, and guarantees. So we work with the grants and loans, which a lot of our peer organizations work with, but we're actually also capable of working with the de-risking instruments that can really get the private sector in. Look, I'd love to look at your graph. One of the things that's challenging in having that conversation is where you position is actually different for different sectors, technologies, and geographies. And I think we need to recognize that explicitly. It's come up explicitly through our process. But that's a whole nother level of conversation, I think, to have in terms of our programming. So if we could do this with a bit more time next time around in a more sophisticated way, we might actually look at having sort of different risk appetites, as you say, for different parts of our mitigation programming, different parts of our adaptation programming. We have not yet been able to get into that kind of analysis, but I would actually be fascinated to see how you've done the charting for your resilience funds, and see if we can learn something from that as well.
That would be great. And I should have said we had the same difficulty because we used XY in the way you've used colors, and we used some dot sizes to designate the size of the funds also. Because that's the other thing that we were discovering, is that there could be loads of funds in one kind of section of the scatter graph, but they weren't big enough. or they weren't small enough. You couldn't access the project preparation scale grants or loans, and so everybody was up in another corner. So I'll see if I can find the graph because I can show it to you right now, but thanks.
Thanks. Over to Leanne, and definitely, I mean, this choice of what you put in which access, and it can be quite. There are many different possible interpretations. Certainly, one thing that this graph doesn't fully capture is the capacity building readiness type of work that is so important. At the same time, we kind of the graph kind of works in the assumption that it's kind of at the base of all that you see there, but yeah, it's part of the exercise. Leanne.
Yeah, so Liane from the Heinrich Böll Foundation and part of the GCF Observer Network. Apologies, I came in late, but I have a good excuse. I came from the high-level ministerial dialogue on the 100 billion goal. And I know I've seen some version of this before, but that's obviously now a little bit more fine-tuned. And maybe coming out of that discourse, where GCF was mentioned, but maybe not as favorably as you would have been wanted to be mentioned, and particularly in terms of access. So I'm wondering, not to throw a complication or yet another dimension to that graph, but if you wanted to put something like ease of access or possibility to access, and put that with everything else, the financial instrument, your scale, your risk appetite. I wonder whether that would then scramble your picture on there quite a bit, and maybe might be interesting to do a series actually of those that looks at different elements rather than trying to combine everything and you know, pin down if, for example, you're positioned differently on access, or if you're positioned differently on risk appetite. And again, risk appetite, for example, can be defined in multi ways, how that might change it. And I think if you're looking at comparative advantage, you know, the issue of access is obviously a crucial one also to get the pay-in, literally the pay-in, but also the buy-in and support from countries as you're facing replenishment.
So I think you might have had access to the PowerPoint because action is precisely the next element we were going to discuss. So we will turn to that in a second. But absolutely, I mean, yeah, we will now do a little bit more of a deep dive on access. Did you have a comment, please?
Yes, just a quick question. If you may please just go back to the previous slide. In your presentation, you mentioned that a lot of your accredited partners are sitting around that segment where there's the mature markets and asset classes. But what efforts are you guys undertaking to try and maybe spread a little bit of your accredited partners to sit under the experimentation segment of that graph? Because as we've been hearing, a lot of the conversations are also happening that you're having a lot of these institutions who are sitting on cash and are waiting for bankable projects that are just not ticking a lot of the boxes in terms of climate finance. So maybe in terms of your looking at how you are accrediting partners, building capacity, any plans to really focus on that experimentation segment of your graph?
It's a very good question. So I mean, I should probably say at the outset, there are accredited entities spread around the graph. One of the interesting things that we've actually done in the last year, that one of our colleagues who's not here at COP basically led on, was to do a mapping of our accredited entity network and basically look at that against the programming needs. So that's the layer that we're really trying to bring. What are developing countries actually wanting to program with us? And do we have the entities to match with that programming? It's a slightly different question, I think, from this question of capturing innovation. Because I think one of the things we tend to find is actually that entities that have been working for a while tend to have their tried and testeds. So they have their own experts on board, probably that know a certain way of doing things. They're developing their pipelines, and we see that come through. So one of the real questions for us is, how can we bring together, this is a very good question, how do we bring together the innovators, so the people that are having bright ideas, and that might be, it might be on the technology front, it might be on the financial front, it might be in terms of just local and indigenous knowledge, community-based action, different ways of doing things, into the project design. I think that's a nut that we haven't quite been able to crack, but one where potentially there's that complementarity at work. So because Adaptation Fund, Jeff, actually are able to give we talked about scales before, kind of the support at smaller scales, and with the flexibility to bring those ideas through, you know, maybe we recognize that our comparative advantage is let those guys work as the incubators, and then we really pick up those ideas and bring it to scale. But it's a really, really good point, and one where I think, again, we need to have the discussion sort of across our partners in terms of where the real potential is to actually to bring that through and to work it into our business model. That's actually a great segue actually to Liana's point, and you missed the intervention from the gentleman earlier, where he was actually asking, you know, I have a great small scale project on the ground. I think you mentioned it was sort of $20,000 or so. Why can't GCF fund more of that kind of thing? And I think in terms of the access conversation, we have been hearing a lot about access recently. It is really important to get the expectations of sort of what different funders can deliver in line with our business models very clear. And we take that we have to be better in communicating that as well. Because basically we are sort of fit for purpose, if you like, for different things. One of the things we know is that, you know, people do value us, they value our accreditation process for building standards. So the colleague earlier talked about our gender policy, our Indigenous peoples policy, our safeguarding policy. We also have fiduciary policies. So building those standards in the entities that we work with is very important, but that takes time. And so people do get frustrated. A lot of our partners get frustrated with the accreditation process, asking, why on earth does it take this much time? But we know as GCF, it took a lot of time to build us as an organization, to put the policies in place, to put the people in place, to put the mechanisms in place to get our funding out and together. And so building that process, actually getting up to speed, can take an amount of time. But what it then does is, and particularly with direct access entities, I think that is a paradigm shift in itself, because we're building institutions that are capable of channeling that climate change investment directly for countries that have those standards. But that means that if we want to work with these partners, we're not necessarily going to be as fast as we would be if we worked with partners who are ready to go. So again, strategy, what's our choice? Do we invest in the institutions knowing that might take time? Or do we try and work fast, but knowing that means we have to go with existing institutions, and we're not going to have this wonderful paradigm shift that we see in actually bringing new direct access entities on board for programming. So that's kind of just one example of knowing ourselves, I think, and how we play into the access space. That being said, we're going to try and do everything we can within our business model to respond to the urgency of just getting climate finance out there. I've already mentioned the fact that we really want to look at very significant reforms, particularly to our readiness program, because that is smaller scale funding and it should be able to go out much faster than it currently is. So that's something we're working on now, and we'll be bringing proposals to our board on in the new year. Otherwise, we're looking at access through these dimensions of speed, simplicity, harmonization, direct access, and volume. I'll just speak briefly to the ones I haven't touched on yet. So speed is really about programming resources as soon as they're becoming available. And we have actually been doing that this year. So we've actually been allocating resources to the limits of our commitment authority. In fact, we're now in a place where we have more ready pipeline to go than we have commitment authority. So we're having to wait until those contributions come through, until our next board meeting, to actually be able to fully program what we've got in our pipeline. So that's where we are as of November 2022. As mentioned, we actually run out of resources in 2023. So for us, having the voices, the advocacy actually for replenishment so we can keep funding is super critical. That's actually bottom line for access, having the resources to keep funding. Simplicity, we know, is really key. And here, as mentioned, we do want to take a look at the readiness program. We have had updates to the simplified approval process this year. What we're looking for there is whether we can actually help push even further by designing fast track proposals that are more ready to go for uptake for our partners, so they don't have to put all the project development work in themselves. And we've also got the project-specific accreditation process being launched. So that will basically allow partners to bring an idea, a project idea, to the fund directly and just get accredited as an institution for that project idea. So not having to go through the accreditation process, but it's only for one-off proposals. Harmonization is really key as we sit in the pavilion jointly with our sister fund, the GCF, also Adaptation Fund and CIFs. We know that it is immensely complex and confusing for countries to have to run through so many different processes for different climate finance mechanisms. So the focus here is really how can we examine with our sister funds, our policies, our processes, to see how that can be aligned as much as possible. Look, we all have different mandates, we all have different boards, but actually Juan's team again is leading on a piece of work we're doing with the GCF, where we'll actually do a study into policy and process harmonization. Direct access, I've talked about, so I won't go into that again. And then volume, we've actually touched on already, but is really key. Juan mentioned before, and I think someone in the audience mentioned negotiations on the $100 billion goal. In terms of our annual programming, we're about $2 billion per year at the moment. So that's 2% of the 100 billion. And that's nowhere near what developing countries actually need to implement mitigation and adaptation action. So if we look at the scale of the need, I think we're something like 0.5% or less on an annual basis, which makes it absolutely critical that we are actually able to use our funds to have the greatest impact they can and to move as many other dollars as they can. So I know that this is a hot topic, access. I know we're coming towards the end, but very, very happy to hear further feedback, reflections from our audience. Thanks for staying with us on this critical topic of access. Thanks, Juan.
Thanks, Alina. So let me really jump straight to looking for your inputs, your reactions, your comment. This is the last piece of the discussion for today. So of course, if you also have any sort of additional reflections that maybe were not covered, please feel free to share.
Sorry for coming in again. I'm just going back to the colleague who had the great project for which he needs 20,000 or 50,000. And basically what I hear is a more categorical, that's not the business model of the GCF. I would disagree. While, you know, there might be a challenge to accessing those sums directly, I think there is nothing in your work with all the accredited entity and the diversity of accredited entities that you have to encourage and cajole them. And the Green Climate Fund has done that in many other policy fields as well, to bring into their programming that kind of access specifically that allows those very small scale, but locally led, on the ground, sustained, because they build the capacity of local populations, but also sustained because they're sustainable because they respond to the needs of the communities into the programming. And there, I think this is the point where we talked from the Observer Network. A lot of times with you, it's also an obligation, I would say, of those that can access, where a lot of groups, organizations, communities cannot access, to actually ensure, and you're focused so much on financial intermediaries, to pass that on. And there I would particularly hold some of your greatest accessors to account, meaning MDBs and UN agencies that still, you know, take up the largest share of the multilateral access that is flowing through the Green Climate Fund to work particularly you know, in developing their projects and programs, particularly with integrating those kind of components, small grants programs, small loan programs that are necessary to give the project ideas that colleague has and others a chance for actually getting from the financial, not bounty, but from the financial resources of the Green Climate Fund. And I would argue, and probably a lot of other people as well, that is part of what you need to talk about when you're talking about transformational or paradigm shifting part, that increasing that access for more people on more equitable terms and communities and actors is a crucial piece of it. Thanks.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Leanne. And I think one of the reflections over the years is precisely sort of to see how we can make that work even with the limitations that the model might have. I know that there's some potential sitting there in EDA that can be further explored. The question is perhaps how to reconcile that with the overall programming directions. But Selena, I don't know if you have any reflections on that.
No, it's a very good point, Liana. And I think, again, it comes to, we can be a complex beast. And this is perhaps one example of it. What do we mean by direct access in this case? And what are those different modalities for, let's say, getting the benefit of fund resources? I suppose I just wanted to be clear, and it is hard because when we sit out at our front desk, we have so many people like yourselves come and say, can GCF give my initiative, fantastic initiatives, funding? And we do have to be clear that we can't do that directly. So we don't have the kind of window where yourself or colleagues could write an application, could come to us, and we could actually disperse those resources. And I think that would be a completely different kind of thing for our operations. The other thing we're thinking about when making choices is, what do we, me, Juan, and others in the Secretariat have the ability to administer? But Liana's absolutely right. That's not to say that we don't have mechanisms that we can partner to actually get the benefit of GCF funds to local communities, organizations, business people, entrepreneurs on the ground. And I think actually that was the question from the colleague earlier in terms of what are the mechanisms to actually make that bridge between international finance, which sits up here, and the lived experience and the solution potential of people who are working on the ground. And so, Liana, I think it was before you came, but we did sort of talk about, yes, what is the potential for our partners, for actually GCF to work with our partners to put together those kinds of funding proposals that use our fund in a pooled way and through more easy to access mechanisms once it gets to the country level, to the local and community level, to get that money onto the ground. So we do have numerous examples of those types of proposals. They are perhaps not as numerous as they could be. So we're always looking at partners to be able to do that kind of design, basically to be able to amplify that impact. But it's very well recognized. We did actually we had a bit of a conversation about it earlier as well. Yeah.
Okay, I'm very mindful of time, especially thinking of our technicians that have been here all day. But perhaps as we conclude, if there are any other comments or questions before we close. Okay, well, I want to thank you all very much for making the time and joining us today. This is a consultation. A lot of your points or questions really make us reflect as we're continuing to work in revising the updated strategic plan that we'll be submitting to the board. So for that, thank you all very much. Celine, any last closing words?
The only thing I'll say, normally the presenters or the panel gets a round of applause, but if I can just actually invite us to give ourselves collectively a round of applause, because we've demanded your participation in this session and we've learned as much for it, hopefully, as you've learned from us. So if we can just all maybe even stand up, because it's late in the afternoon, and a round of applause for the conversation. It's been a great time.